Welcome to Leading the Conversation. This month, I have a conversation with a leader who is learning how to be the kind of neighbor that Jesus has called her and her congregation to be. I want to share with you an interview that I had with Pastor Ingrid Rasmussen, who is the lead pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Their congregation is located in the heart of where there has been so much protest and unrest since George Floyd was killed last year. Their congregation is around the corner from the 3rd Precinct police building that was burned down, and they have been learning how to listen to the needs of their neighbors, how to serve in their community, how to deal with the inequality that exists, and be a community of people that is white, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So I hope that you will learn a lot from this conversation. I know that I did. Thanks for participating and leading the conversation. I would love it if you just shared a little bit about who you are and where you serve.
I am Ingrid Rasmussen, and I serve as the lead pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. It's in South Minneapolis. If people know Minneapolis at all, it's right off of the intersection of Lake Street and Minnehaha Avenue. And I have been at Holy Trinity now for about 8 years. I started there as the associate pastor and then moved into the lead pastor role about 4 years ago. And it's a wonderful faith community, a faith community that's really committed and embedded in the community in which we live and serve. And so we love the Longfellow neighborhood and seek to be really good neighbors in that community.
What are some words you would use to describe your congregation? Since every congregation has its own personality, what's just a few words you'd throw out?
Committed, active, curious, questioning, powerful, changing, adaptive. One thing that I often say about Holy Trinity is that it's filled with activists, and so the other pastors and rostered leaders and I are just like running to keep up with the activity of the congregation. We don't have to like create energy. We just like run to keep up with the energy of the place.
Well, and there has been plenty of things to be activist about and engage in, especially in this past year and with COVID and with demands for racial justice. So I'd love to learn more about you as a called leader. What are some significant mile markers along the way in your life that have led you to where you are today?
That's a good question. I am the daughter of a church organist. So I grew up on Saturday nights laying under the organ pipes in my hometown congregation of Cottonwood, Minnesota, as my mom practiced the organ for Sunday mornings. So I feel like church music and church hymnody and church liturgy are just sort of like baked into who I am. And if you would have asked me even 15 years ago, would you imagine that you'd be a parish pastor? I'd say, no way. I don't want to be a parish pastor. And just through a series of events like my first job out of college, which was working in a free healthcare clinic, or somebody encouraging me to consider seminary education, or a couple of internships that I had internationally, I feel like the Spirit was moving me along the spectrum towards word and sacrament ministry. And now I feel like, wow, what a privilege and honor to be serving in this role. But it's not one that I imagined for myself. And still, when I wake up in the morning, it's still a surprise to me that I serve as a parish pastor. So if there are others out there who are listening who think to themselves, uh, that kind of sounds like my story. Well, the Spirit has a funny way of transforming our lives in ways that we never expected.
Where you said you lived internationally, where have you traveled to?
Yeah, a couple of really formative experiences. So I served in as a part of the Lutheran World Federation in Geneva, Switzerland. So I worked in their International Affairs and Human Rights Office. And then another formative experience was in Israel, Palestine. So I lived in and served and learned in the West Bank for a period of time. And so those two experiences, I think, really shaped my understanding of the church and the world and how important faith communities are for empowering change and equity, both nationally and internationally.
All right. I wanted to invite you to have this conversation with me because we are coming to the 1 year mark of the killing of George Floyd. And so much has happened in this past year. And I myself started following you when I saw the things that your mom was posting on Facebook, since I was already Facebook friends with your mom. And I watched some of your Facebook Live videos, and we were praying for your congregation and for your part of Minneapolis, and for all the people impacted in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. And we collected some cleaning supplies and some money, and even brought those down at one point last summer. And so we've been journeying with your congregation from afar. And I would just like to hear some of your reflections on what this year has been like. I mean, maybe you could think back to those early days in the protest, or what you've learned since, or both of those things.
Thank you. Yeah. And first of all, just let me say thank you for all the ways that you have journeyed with Holy Trinity. It has been just an amazing experience of being connected with people of faith across time and space during both COVID and during the time of the uprising and the months since. So thank you. We would not have, I don't think we would have survived this past year as a congregation in quite the same way without the loving arms of both our neighborhood and the wider community that stretched to every continent. And so we're so deeply thankful for the support. Yeah, as we approach the 1 year anniversary, it is a good time to think back to those early days. The day after George Floyd was murdered, I got a call late in the evening from a neighborhood person who said that the uprising and social unrest had really found its way to the 3rd precinct, which is the issuing precinct for the officers that were involved in George Floyd's arrest and killing. And the caller asked if the church would consider opening our doors to become the medic station for the neighborhood. And it was a big ask because, like so many communities of faith, we had really closed down our facility, trying to be a good neighbor in the midst of COVID and slow the spread in our own community. And so when the caller asked, I said, let me check with a few other church leaders. I called the other pastors, I called the council president, and we together, in about a matter of 20 minutes, made the decision to go from doors sealed shut to doors propped wide open. And we began serving as the medic station for the neighborhood. And we did that for several days and nights through kind of the height of the unrest in the Longfellow neighborhood. And thinking back to those days, there was so much righteous anger filling the streets. There was so much chaos, so much tear gas. The injuries were great for those people who were coming in to seek medical attention, and the fires were all around us. And so those days and nights were really traumatic for all of us who were there, and for the whole community that was experiencing either it firsthand, or the world that was experiencing it watching the news, because we know that everybody's eyes were on our portion of the city during those days. And after the smoke cleared, we then found that our next faithful response was to become the basic food and necessities distribution for the neighborhood. Our groceries, we had gone from being this food-rich community to being a food desert overnight. So we no longer had access to groceries or Target or Walgreens, and people were really having trouble using public transportation because of all of the blockades and other hurdles that were put into place in our area of Minneapolis. And so we started to just serve as this mutual aid center of sorts. And we've never served as a food pantry. We've never served as a resource center. And so we were just learning as we went. It was, we have never known the ending before we began something this past year. Everything has been learning on the fly. And the first day, there were a couple of hundred people that we served. The next day, that number doubled. The next day, that number doubled. The next day, that number doubled. So we were serving about anywhere between, I'd say, on average, 1,500 to 2,000 people or households a day in those days that then stretched over the course of the summer. For several months, we served in that capacity. And we, as I think back about everything that has transpired for our community over these past months, it has been a couple of things come to my mind. By the time I got to the church on that first night during the height of the unrest, the doors were propped open and neighbors were stationed outside of our doors where ushers would typically stand. And I thought, this is a picture of a new vision for the church. It's not an insider outsider model. It's the walls become more permeable. A colleague of mine calls it the church turned inside out. And so we've gotten a taste of that, because nothing we've done, of course, would have been possible without that model this past year. So there's a permeability to the church now that I don't think we can go back from. Another thing about the church that I think I've learned this year is, like, white supremacy often has taught me in my own body to want to know the ending before I begin. So there's something about this being prudent. Sometimes we even call it faithful, to like analyze every situation and then play out everything that could go wrong.
Endless discernment.
Endless discernment. That's a great question. Let me take it to the church committee in 2 weeks, and then I'll get back to you in 4. And sometimes we don't have 4 weeks to do the discernment. And anybody who knows me would tell you, I love discernment. I'm not anti-discernment. But there is something about being a little bit more nimble, a little bit more agile as communities of faith, and actually seeing and hearing the needs and the gifts that are articulated by the people who are standing right in front of us, asking us to be their partner in ministry, and then responding. And so there's something in me that's changing, or at least being challenged, that that's really encouraging me to um, to move, move, to move. Maybe that's just it, to respond, to think of about agility as one of the fruits of the Spirit, and in that way, I think it's a move away from like power and control, which sometimes gets the church into trouble, and a movement towards love, and a movement towards compassion, and a movement toward like deep relationality. And I think Jesus is always like moving towards deep relationality. If we read the gospel stories, it's just like always a move toward the neighbor. And I'm trying to reshape my understanding of what it means to be a Christian leader with that in mind, and some of these learnings in mind. So that's more than you wanted to know, but
No, that's amazing. I actually think this is the most exciting time to be a Jesus follower. Like
yeah,
this is a time where the rubber meets the road. This is the time where we can actually be in tune with the messiness of church life, of what it's supposed to be when we're out there moving into the world.
yeah,
And at our congregation, we do sermon series, and on Pentecost, we end with our Rise Up sermon series, and we've been going through the book of Acts. But it's just the whole book of Acts is the Holy Spirit pushing people out and just pushing them farther. And it is that the church is supposed to be this nimble. I loved some of the describing words you used about what kind of an animal you had to shape yourself into as a church, as a congregation, to meet the need this year. And I think that's probably what the church has always been invented to do and be.
so I think so. I think you're absolutely right. It's not a new vision of the church. It's the vision that we were given. And then I think somehow we've and I'll just speak for my own community, in a predominantly white denomination and congregation, there's this sense that we've morphed it into something else. So it's really a reclamation of what we were given. So, it's like, I'm not making up anything new. I'm just like, in some ways returning to these stories and to the narrative that we're giving, and looking again at them and saying, what is the church being called to? What is Jesus teaching here? How is Christ leading the way into a new way of being in the world? And it's hard work. It's hard work, but we're trying to do it.
Yeah. I'm wondering what Bible passages, or are there any stories or themes in the Bible that have just been resonating with you and feeding you or inspiring you over this past year?
Yes. So one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, are all the pictures of the disciples that we get, and the disciples are called into ministry that they don't know the ending to. And they often are not very good at what they're doing. They stumble over and over again. They want to know the answers before it's time for the answers. They ask questions that they shouldn't in the moment. And I feel like that's kind of me, these days, is stumbling through ministry and through relationships with a neighborhood that's suffering and attempting to rebuild and rebirth something new. And there's something comforting about that, like for those of us who were shaped by a culture that really privileged perfection or finesse or polish. I think there's something about this year that is just encouraging me to let go of the need to do it right and instead move into an attempt to do it well with the neighbor. And that's what I see the disciples doing over and over in these stories. So that has been really powerful. The other one that often comes to my mind is Psalm 139. And I often read Psalm 139 at the bedside of the dying. So when I go to meet with somebody who is nearing death, I'll read those words. And the psalmist says, "You hem me in behind and before." And there's something about that image that has been really powerful for me this year in the midst of so much uncertainty. That God promises to be Emmanuel, promises to be with us, promises to accompany us, promises to be an ally in the movement towards a more equitable, more loving, more just world. And that being hemmed in really has been a comfort for me, particularly on the tough days this past year.
And you mentioned it, and I think most people know that the ELCA is overwhelmingly white. I think in Lenny Duncan's book, Dear Church, he says we're the whitest denomination in the US. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's been stumping me this year, and I'd love to hear your wisdom, is what is it? Why are we so afraid to hear the story of people who have suffered at the hands of racial injustice? Like, as a white person, why is it so hard for so many of my white brothers and sisters to just acknowledge and to hear that someone of another race has experienced something very different than they have in this exact same country? Why is it so hard to hear it?
It's a great question. And I don't know that I have much wisdom to share here. There's something about the way that we have been trained that causes us to either shut down or shatter or fracture when we hear about the pain of another, particularly pain that we haven't experienced ourselves in quite the same way.
And you mentioned the fragility, but it also seems to come with a lot of defensiveness, because I find when there is people pushing back on why we're engaging the topic of race, that they somehow maybe think that the hard things they've gone through don't count, or that they have to apologize for being white. That's one thing I've heard a number of times. And I think it really is what God is calling all of us to, is to claim who each of us is, the hard things, the good things, to bring our whole selves before God and before one another, and also then be willing to accept that someone else will bring their whole selves and their whole experience, and that reconciliation can't happen unless both people are willing to enter into that. I mean, and so I would love to have the church be claiming that mission that we have of always going out and doing it with that sense of vulnerability and penetrability, where we could be willing to hear someone else's story. And we don't have to deny the things that made me or you, but we also then can find a way to welcome another story too. And I think it is just hard because it seems to happen one-on-one. You can't have you can't put a sticker on Facebook or just a quote on Facebook and expect that there will be deep change in the person who reads your Facebook post. But it's those actual conversations where maybe you can even get a little mad at each other, misunderstand each other, or have it be an awkward conversation. I would love that to be what the church is known for, that place where people can have that that conversation where righteous pain and righteous anger can coexist together.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings up for me when you say that the sense of, one of the things that the church is called to do is move away from this sense of scarcity. So I think when you say, when I hear about a neighbor's pain that's not like my own, that quick move that I make to move to my own pain and say, well, what about, X, Y, and Z that I've endured? I think that often arises out of this scarcity mindset, and it lives in me, it lives in all of us, that like somehow the world is a pie, and if somebody takes a piece out of it, there's less of it for me, like there's less compassion left for me or something like that. And instead, if we moved to and the church always talks about this, a move towards abundance, like there's more than enough compassion in this world. God plants more than enough empathy in this world for all of us. Then maybe we come at those conversations with reservoirs that are filled rather than reservoirs that are depleted. And it allows us to really just hear the neighbor without feeling like somehow it takes something away from us, from me. So I really appreciate that point. There's what the church is called to do is shape a new worldview where we can stand in solidarity in joy and in suffering with one another. And solidarity doesn't mean that we've experienced what another person is saying, but it means that we believe what another person is saying is true, and we stand beside them in what they're experiencing. So thank you for bringing that up. It's important.
At the beginning of our conversation, you one of the describing words you used for your congregation is that they are activists. And the word activist can be a politically charged term, and probably rightfully so, because whatever side you're an activist with or against, you're fighting for something. And I'm wondering what you have learned in this past year about activism, maybe your own or the kind of activism your congregation has been engaged in.
I think it's been important for me to try to be a follower. So find amazing Black, Indigenous people of color who are leading, who have vision, who already have a sense of the way that the world could be reshaped in order to make it a more equitable space for them and for people in their communities. And I think so being an activist for our congregation has often meant that like we're out on the front line, and we're the ones with the, what are they called?
The bullhorn
The
or
bullhorn.
megaphone.
Yeah, we're the ones with the microphone. And this year it's been much more of a process of listening to the community, listening to our BIPOC neighbors, and seeing how it is that we can use what we've got, people, resources, time, energy, space, building. We still have a building for the sake of the community. And so being an activist, I think we've learned something new this year, that we're testing muscles of being followers.
What skills do you think you've gained as a leader in the position you're in this year? What have you learned? What are you going to take with you from this past year of COVID and joining your neighborhood in new ways this year?
So I have been part of this neighborhood collective called Longfellow Rising. It's a group of business owners, nonprofit leaders, other stakeholders who came together in the wake of the fires and then started meeting on the church's front lawn, and then have been really meeting every week, at least once a week since last June. So for a year, our neighbors have been gathering together to be with one another. And one of the skills that I have really needed to hone in that is just like that skill of gathering, or the art of gathering. And I've been learning a lot about that from neighbors, like theater directors who are a part of the group, and others who are really good at gathering people and acknowledging that we're real humans that come together. We bring things with us each time that we come together. And isn't that what the church also wants to acknowledge, is that we come as like these beautiful and broken people each time that we come together for prayer or for worship. And so there's something about the art of gathering too that I've learned this year, but ask me in another year and I'll be able to actually tell you what that means.
Well, what's one hope that you have for your church community and your greater community, the Longfellow neighborhood of Minneapolis, and maybe one hope for the greater church?
Sure. My hope for our faith community, for Holy Trinity, is that the doors that were propped open during the uprising, I hope they remain propped open for the next 117 years. I hope that our life in and outside of the building is as rich and fluid as it was in those really chaotic days. So that's a hope I have for the church. The hope that I have for the community is that we use our collective power to ensure that the righteous anger that we saw reflected in the streets is also reflected in the way that the community comes back. So whether that's through the built form, through buildings, or through community building activities, I want to ensure that that the call for Black lives to matter in those early days is also at the foundation of whatever it is that happens in Longfellow as we seek to recover from the social disaster that we experienced. And then I think for the church, for the wider church, I think for the wider church, my hope is that we would lean into, in my life and in my experience of the ELCA, we really like good order. There's something about good order that really gets us. And anytime that good order is kind of disrupted, then there's something, we're quick, and I'll just speak for myself. I'm quick to want to like pull it back. You know, if something feels outside of my control, or if it feels like we're deviating too far away from tradition or whatever, I just want like to continue to hold it. And so our kind of obsession with good order, I think sometimes gets in the way of our call to engage in rich community and in love of neighbor. And so I want to like, I want to just like lean back from good order a little bit, and then like lean into a little bit more trouble, a little bit more good trouble in the years to come. So I hope that can be true for the ELCA. We'll see.
Well, and that's one positive that I hope for our church that comes out of the whole experience of COVID, because that very much has been an experience where we have not known what things look like at the end, when we start out. I mean, and I think of actually that training of that discipline of living on faith, leaning into faith, as I think about last March, and it's like, okay, we might have to be shut down for 8 weeks. And that just seemed like the longest amount of time in the world before we'd gone through it. And yet we mobilized in my context, and I know in yours and in all the other communities, like we figured things out. People were creative. People found ways to be safe and gather. And we didn't get everything figured out, but yet there's so much just creativity and going with the Spirit and trying something that we never would have tried before. And when it has turned into this lasting over a year, and then in the midst of it, having protests and having all sorts of other things that our communities are responding to and engaging in, like, it's just an experiment in faith and leaning into where God is going. And I won't get this quote just right, but William Willimon has a quote about faith being this breathless attempt to keep up with the redemptive activity of God, of looking around in the world and saying, God, where are you going next? And that just seems like what we all have been living in different ways and in different forms.
Yeah, I love that. Being on the lookout for what's next, not knowing, but keeping our hearts open to where we're being called to serve, I think is a beautiful understanding of what faith looks like these days.
Yeah. I'm wondering, as we close, what is something that brings you joy?
Yeah, I forgot to say that when I got that call to open the church as a medic station, I was 9 months pregnant, or 8 months pregnant. So I, about 3 or 4 weeks after the uprising in our neighborhood, I gave birth to Lars, who is a beautiful little baby. And he's now, approaching his first birthday. And then I also have a 3-year-old as well. So there's something about those kids living in the present and the joy that fills them each and every day, regardless of what's happening in the world. There's something that keeps me connected to that piece of life. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be a mom, even though it's been a real messy year to be a mom. I'm grateful for that opportunity, and that's an important part of who I am.
Wow. Well, thank you, Ingrid, and blessings to you and your congregation and your community.
Thanks so much. Thanks for engaging me in this.